kicking off today's conversation about the INN network with a preview of what's happening across the field. The INN Index is the most comprehensive study of the state of nonprofit news, thanks to submissions from hundreds of members across the INN network. And the experts on all that data are INN's research director, Emily Roseman, and researcher, Jesse Holcomb. Hey, Emily. Hey, Jesse.
Hey, Jonathan.
Hey, Jonathan.
So we now have 4 years of data from the index, which are giving us new insights into how nonprofit newsrooms are growing and gives us a better idea of what the future of journalism will look like. Emily, before I give you and Jesse the stage, I wanted to ask a quick question. Are you ready for the hot seat?
Oh, no. Fire away.
Do we have a choice?
So I want to hear from both of you. What are you most excited about in this year's index?
Oh, good, a softball question. I'm excited. I've had a lot of fun going through the audience data in this year's index survey. Jesse, what about you?
I'm encouraged to see growth in individual giving across the field over the past few years. I think that's a good sign for the field.
Yeah.
Well, I love hearing you talk about audience data, Emily, because as many of our members and most of my colleagues know, I'm truly obsessed with member audience growth. And we just brought on Sam Cholke to work with our members on audience growth. So I'm super excited to hear what you have to say and to use those findings to drive the work we do with our members going forward. Okay, Emily, the stage is yours, and I'll see you back here in a little while.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for that introduction. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this session on the sustained growth of nonprofit news. In this session, we're going to review some of our key findings from INN's latest index survey. Jonathan already kindly introduced us. I'm Emily. I'm the research director at INN. Jesse, do you want to say hello?
Sure. Thank you, Emily. I've been working with the INN team supporting their research efforts for the past 5 years. I am based in West Michigan, where I'm faculty at Calvin University. Spent about the last 15 years of my life doing survey and public opinion work around the news business with Knight, Gallup, and the Pew Research Center.
And we're extremely lucky to work with both Jesse and one of my colleagues, Michelle McClellan, who also helps us greatly with the index survey each year. So let's jump right in. The INN Index, many of you are familiar what the index is, but just a review for those of you who aren't familiar, it's the most comprehensive study of nonprofit news. It's a survey that INN has conducted across its membership since 2017. And this past cycle in 2021, we saw a 94% response rate across our membership, which means that we're really approaching a census of the field. We now have 4 years of trend data, which we'll be discussing some of those findings today. Our full index report comes out later in the summer, so please consider this a sneak preview of some of our big headlines. Quick review of our agenda for the session today. So I'm going to review what makes nonprofit news stand out and just try to highlight some of the characteristics of nonprofit news. I'm then going to pass it to Jesse to explain some of our really exciting trend data that shows 2 kinds of growth emerging across the nonprofit news field. Then we'll conclude with a discussion of some of the challenges and opportunities we see for the field. So quick review, what is nonprofit news? Why are we here? Well, there's a few characteristics that INN really sees across our work, not even just in the index, that highlights what makes nonprofit news stand out. Nonprofit news has unique values. It values independence. It is financially transparent news that is really representative and is grounded in a community. Nonprofit news produces in-depth, original reporting that is then shared widely across partners. It is co-produced across collaborators. And perhaps most importantly, nonprofit news is incredibly resilient. It is a type of journalism that is here to stay, and you'll learn more about why we think that in the next few slides. So I've been saying nonprofit news. Nonprofit news is really an umbrella term that we use to describe different types of nonprofit journalism. One way we think about the types of nonprofit news is through the geographic scope of the outlets that we study and serve. In this year's survey, we found that local news outlets are now approaching about half of nonprofit news. So we talk a lot about local news in this presentation, and we also talk about national and global outlets, which collectively form a little more than a quarter of the field. We also talk about state and regional outlets that collectively form a little less than a third of the field of nonprofit news. So please keep those terms in mind throughout this presentation. And what is this coverage like? Well, nonprofit news really produces in-depth coverage. Since 2017, the field's focus has really been on investigative journalism, and that has shifted. But today, we tend to see that there's an equal proportion of outlets that cover the news, that explain the news, and that find something out before it's news. Even beyond the outlets that primarily focus on investigative storytelling, we do see that across the network, many outlets leverage investigative skill sets. 80% of outlets leverage skills of an investigative journalist or editor last year. 70% of outlets conducted one or more FOIA requests, and across the network, close to 3,000 databases were published or made accessible last year. This high quality and in-depth coverage extends across now more than 7,100 third-party publishers, and that's really a mix of broadcast partners, of web, of newspapers, and this is something that we've seen growing over time, this third-party reach. So how is this kind of form of journalism supported? Well, I'm going to just quickly review kind of the main ways nonprofit news is fueled. And I'm going to share this information by showing you the revenue pies for the three primary types of nonprofit news split across by those geographic scopes that I mentioned a few minutes ago. So to start, we're going to look at the revenue pie for national and global outlets. You can see that close to 60% of funding that goes to national and global outlets comes from foundations. I've always been impressed with the size of individual giving dollars that state and regional outlets are able to attract, and you can see that represented in the 38% slice in the darker blue. And individual giving dollars is, again, another umbrella term to represent financial contributions from individuals ranging from major donors all the way down to small dollar donors and members. And finally, local news outlets, you'll see, are able to maintain a fairly diverse mix of different kinds of revenue. And I'll just draw your attention here to that orange slice. Close to 30% of revenue going to local news outlets comes from earned sources. And earned revenue is a term we use to describe revenue from advertising and sponsorship dollars. So much of those trends I've just highlighted have more or less stayed the same year over year across our index data. But what is new? Why are you here today? Well, we're here to really highlight how nonprofit news is growing on two fronts. The first front of growth that we see is growth among the established nonprofit news outlets. And that kind of growth can really be understood as total revenue growth, as audience growth, as staff growth. This kind of gets back to the resiliency point I made earlier. The second point, and really exciting kind of growth that we're seeing, is the growth of local news startups, which we'll discuss later on in this presentation. But we're going to start by focusing on the kind of growth that we see across this established set of outlets. And to do that, we have a super exciting data set of 92 publishers that have been reporting data to us over the last 4 years. So Jesse, I'm going to pass it to you to take us through this data.
Thank you, Emily. So I want to talk a little bit about what we're calling the index trend set. And what is that? That's essentially a representative mix of 92 publishers that have been around since 2017 or earlier. So they're more or less an established part of the field. But this is a group of publishers that provided data to the INN index going back to 2017, and also provided data in the current year's data set. So we have a pretty robust group of organizations that we're able to look at over time, and that gives us kind of a unique window into what's changing. So looking from year 2018 through 2021, it's a few year stretch. It's not a huge amount of time, but it's enough time to actually see some patterns. First, I want to highlight that about 2/3 of the outlets in this trend cohort increased their total annual revenue between that stretch of years. Typical outlet grew their total revenue by about 25%. So for that cohort that grew their revenue, that's nearly 70% of these outlets. Here's what that looks like, okay, in a little bit more detail. 68% grew, 15% stayed about steady. That is in 2018 versus 2021. They had about similar share. And then there were 17% of organizations whose revenue declined. We broke this out looking at different revenue buckets or categories to see which of these categories were stronger or maybe not quite as strong for the cohort. First, looking at foundation funding. Here, we saw that foundation funding held largely steady. More than half of the outlets in this cohort increased foundation funding over that 4-year time frame, with a median increase of 38%. About a quarter of the outlets in our trend set retained foundation funding amounts during this time, and a sixth reported decrease. The median increase for the group was more than $45,000. Looking at individual giving, and again, this includes small donors, includes membership revenue, it also includes major donor dollars. In that bucket, we saw individual giving grew 53% over a 4-year period, from more than 31 million across the cohort to more than 48 million in 2021. Per outlet, that translates to a growth of about $38,000 per outlet. And I should say that all types of outlets reported individual giving growth, with nearly 7 out of 10 local, state, and regional, and national and global outlets reporting gains. National outlets increased individual giving the most, more so than locals, state, and regional. Okay. Taking a look at earned revenue, this was a revenue category where we saw the most volatility over this 4-year period, especially for local news. Across our trend set, about half of the outlets included reported an increase in earned revenue. Over a third experienced decrease. Right? The median revenue for this group was essentially unchanged. The biggest decline here, and we're looking at a 4-year period, but I want to focus on 2020 to 2021, where local organizations, many of them told us that a big reason for this tough year was local businesses declining due to COVID-19. There are some early indications that this is rebounding, but in short, a lot of this data makes sense if you think about what's been going on in the business sector because of the pandemic over the past 2 years. And I should note that earned revenue, yes, a big chunk is advertising and sponsorship, but events too. It would be included in that portion of earned revenue. That was tough over the pandemic period. Okay. Taking a brief pause, looking at a little deeper at individual giving, because again, I want to reinforce that all types of outlets, whether they're local, state, regional, national, and global, experienced increases in individual giving over this time frame. We think this is encouraging, think it's really important. It's a sign of not just a revenue sustainability and growth, but also engagement. We saw that small dollar donors were growing fastest here in this 4-year period. Nearly 80% of the outlets in our cohort increased small donor or member revenue. And you keep in mind that small donor dollars weren't highly developed in 2017 or earlier. All right. So again, we see this as engagement with audiences, as proof of that kind of connection point, as much as it is growth in the business side. We saw a median increase in small dollar donations of about $24,000. Let's talk about audience change over this 4-year period for our trend set for a moment. We found that 2/3 of the outlets in the trend set increased their web traffic from 2018 to 2021. That was a 54% median increase across monthly unique visitors. We also saw growth in email subscribers too from that period. 3/4 of outlets grew their subscribers over the 4 years. That translated to a 33% median increase across newsletter subscriptions. Just as a reminder, we're working with small numbers here. Total audience size is pretty small across the field, but again, many of these organizations are really small. So considering that context, it's important, and there's a lot of value in the growth that we're seeing. Okay. Right. Nonprofit news as a sector proved stable and resilient through crisis years. I want to pause on this for a moment. The year 2020 was an exceptional year for many reasons, between the presidential, not just any presidential election, the one that we had, an anti-racism movement, COVID-19. There's a lot going on in 2020. How did the nonprofit journalism sector emerge out of all that? And so what I want to say here is that, we talked about the 4-year trend data, but it's important to note this growth continued over that 4 years despite the COVID crisis year. Here's what we saw in that last year. Between 20 and 21, all right, again, we're moving beyond talking about the 4-year stretch. We're just looking at 2020 to 2021. We saw total revenue and staffing figures grow. Total field-wide revenue and staffing figures were up. Okay, looking at the cohort of INN's digital-first independent publishers, generated an estimated $400 million in 2021. That was up from between 300 and 350 million reported the previous year. Okay. Looking at individual giving, donors and dollars held steady. Most news outlets retained the news dollars and donors brought in 2021. By the end of 2021, median individual giving revenue per outlet was at $77,000. That's consistent with what we saw in 2020, which was about $75,000 typically. Okay. Direct audience sizes returned to 2019 levels. Okay. And we saw this across the media sector at large, right? You see it in the polling data. The Gallup night polling data showed a spike in attention to news in 2020, went back down. You see it across the news industry, almost regardless of sector. What we saw in the nonprofit news sector was a spike in attention, 2020. But then after that, direct audience levels returned to 2019 levels. So there was growth, there was a spike, and then back down to those levels, but not necessarily retreating or retrenching. We also see third-party distribution growth too, which is another and somewhat more difficult dimension of audience to measure, but it's important. Okay, lots of organizations working through partnerships and publishing arrangements that are increasing their reach. Through those partnerships, that also experienced growth as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Jesse, for reviewing that. And just, Jesse, that data is so fascinating that we have 4 years of trend data to really get a sense of those established nonprofit news outlets that have been publishing before 2017. We're now going to pivot and change gears to really observe the second front of growth that we saw emerge in our data this year, and that's the data around our local news startups. So let's turn to focus on that second kind of phase of growth. This next chart, I think, really exemplifies this really incredible growth we're seeing in the number of outlets launching year over year. You can see in the last 4 years, close to double the number of outlets launched than in the previous 4-year period. And you can see this number reflected in INN's membership data as well. Our early membership data from 2022 reports that this rate of growth is still on track. And I just want to note, this is pertinent to locals because well over half, 55% of those launches since 2017 are local outlets. And this growth in local has become more pronounced in the last couple of years. In 2020, 57% of new launches were local. This past year in 2021, that number jumped to 65% of launches were local. And again, what we're seeing in our early membership data is that this growth is continuing. This rate of growth is being retained. So we expect to see many more local news outlets launch and then join INN membership in the coming year. Now, what kind of local news outlets are we talking about here? Because, there's the large locals that serve metro areas. There's the tiny news outlets that are serving neighborhoods and towns. Well, Jesse and his team of research assistants coded all of our local news outlets in our data by population size, by the market size that they are serving. Small market in orange, you can see, is on the fastest growth track. And small market we define as populations of 100,000 or less, mid-sized between 100,000 and 1 million, large 1 million and over. And again, you can see that local startups are really expanding to serve those smaller markets. Now let's take a step back from all of the data and numbers for a moment here, because sometimes it really doesn't do this justice, this incredible growth that we're seeing and what this growth means for, the American public. I'm just going to highlight just a few of our exceptional members, or a few of our exceptional local news outlet members that have launched in the last few years. And what you're looking at now is a heat map of where those local news outlets have launched since 2017. But to start, this is San Jose Spotlight. They launched in January of 2019 as an outlet dedicated to political and business reporting. And their mission is to change the face of local journalism by building a community-supported newsroom that ignites civic engagement, educates citizens, and strengthens democracy. And founder Ramona Juarez was inspired by the model of the Nevada Independent, a member of INN, and she was determined to bring that model to San Jose, her hometown. Let's go to Cicero. Cicero Independiente launched in 2019. Co-founder Irene Romulo started down a path in journalism after seeing the media's shortcomings. And prior to co-founding Cicero, Irene worked as an immigration organizer and observed firsthand how media was not meeting the information needs of immigrant communities. So Irene applied to and received a fellowship with INN member City Bureau. And during that fellowship, she met other Cicero residents, and together they joined forces to form this outlet. Let's go down to Atlanta. Canopy Atlanta is a community journalism nonprofit that launched in 2020. Already, they've become a trailblazer for developing new models of journalism. Local communities across Atlanta help the Canopy team choose story topics, and Canopy then trains and pays residents known as journalism fellows to tell those community stories alongside experienced journalists. And those stories are then shared back with the community through events and printed materials and more. And finally, just my last example of these local startups in action is El Paso Matters. Robert Moore launched El Paso Matters after community leaders approached him about their concern about the state of local news in the region. And with the help of funding from the El Paso Community Foundation, the newsroom launched in 2020 as a member-supported media organization that focuses on expanding civic capacity in the region. So those are just a few stories. There's hundreds of stories like this. These are a few of our local startup members and what their work means to their community. Now, in sharing those stories, I also want to bring your attention to a few qualities that we see emerge across this growing set of local startups. You heard me say a few times the word civic. We see in our index data that inspiring or enabling people to get involved in civic life is emerging as a primary impact mission of this growing local news segment. This is a kind of a new form of impact that nonprofit journalism is focusing on. You also heard in my stories, many of those outlets are primarily or explicitly serving communities of color in their areas and developing new models of distribution and information needs tracking in order to do that. And finally, I just want to throw back, a point we made earlier on the local news distinct revenue model. it'll be important to kind of keep that revenue model in mind as this local segment is surging, and kind of tracking how we can replicate this model in communities across the country. Okay, that is a note of hope from me, but we're now going to transition for the next few minutes to talking about a few challenges and opportunities we see across the field of nonprofit news. And I'm just going to pause here and say, I have no visibility on the chat, by the way, but if you have any questions for Jesse and I, please drop them in the Q&A tab of our platform, and we'll have a few minutes to take a few questions after we wrap with our observations on challenges and opportunities. So Jesse, I'll pass it back to you.
All right, thank you, Emily. So yes, challenges and opportunities, let us dive right in. The first one I want to point to is this incredibly important issue in the INN world and the journalism world at large. Staff diversity remains highly variable. We see in our annual tracking that looking at staff across the sector, 53% identify as white, 36% are journalists of color. And we also have some that either didn't report or don't know. We're working on that. Transparency in reporting this information is, at very least, it's a baseline. It's a necessity. And it's really important that we're able to collect this data, at very least, to be transparent with everyone else and to show the field and the rest of the world where we're at. The numbers you see here are more or less about the same in terms of composition, distribution, as we saw last year. As one benchmark, people of color make up about 38% of the US workforce. That share is projected to grow to about 43% by 2028, according to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. But there's a lot underneath these numbers. Racial and ethnic representation remains highly variable across the field. For instance, about a third of all outlets in our sample account for 83% of all staff of color field-wide. So it's not widely distributed across the field. And a large portion of that 1/3 that I just mentioned are outlets with a primary mission to serve communities of color, sometimes referred to as ethnic media. Okay, the index collects essential diversity data like this annually and conducts a diversity, equity, inclusion deep dive every 3 years. Next year's 2023 survey will be that deep dive, and will report on any progress made at the leadership board level from 2020 to 2022. I also just want to recognize that these are a set of numbers. They don't capture all of the essential and sometimes harder to track, but just as important issues to measure. Issues like burnout, issues like promotion, retention, and development of journalists of color into leadership positions, culture, organizational culture, and industry-wide culture that is not as inclusive as it needs to be. These are all things that really need to be addressed, and collecting data is one place to start. Another challenge, grants mismatched to growth and news needs. What you're seeing here is the share of the field that of the journalistic labor force, if you will, of INN, that is in local news, that's in state news, and that's in national and global news. Okay, the orange bar there represents the percentage of the field's foundation funding that this type of journalism receives. So you can see that although local news outlets employ about 20% of the field's labor force, local outlets only see about 10% of the field's foundation support. In contrast, national and globally focused organizations employ a little over half of the field, yet bring in close to 70% of the field's foundation support. So this essentially means we need to get more funders and folks involved in directing resources and creating new funds to this growing local sector. Okay. Audiences and distribution. So news sharing and collaboration increases journalism's impact. We all know that. Yet it can complicate that direct audience building strategy. And by this, I'm referring to what I mentioned earlier, which is the unique kind of arrangement and ecosystem in the nonprofit news field, where many organizations are trying to develop their own direct audience reach, also working in collaborations and partnerships with other organizations and publishers. So in order to really measure and track the progress in audience growth, especially across those partnerships, the field really needs sophisticated models of audience research. And right now we're kind of underinvested. So that's something that really needs some attention in the years to come. Finally, I'll just mention that search and social, the big realities of audience development today make it hard for people to find news sources of credible information. So this is a challenge that the entire journalism industry is facing. It's absolutely in no way unique to the nonprofit sector, but it's essential to the nonprofit sector. If you want to have impact, if you want to really move the needle and make a difference with the work that you're doing, we all need to really sort of put our efforts together in thinking about how do you actually begin to really reach all of those people and audiences and get your work in front of them. So with that, I think we are moving to Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jesse. It's been such a pleasure working with you on the index this year. And if you haven't already, folks, please drop those questions for us into chat. I know we just threw a lot of numbers and data at you, but rest assured, the full written report will be out soon. And in the meantime, if you have any questions on data that you saw that you want to know more about or want to use for your own organization, please feel free to reach out to either of us anytime. I'll share our emails. Actually, I'll just put up this slide that has our email addresses on it, so any of you can note it. But question from Roshni about the local news field at large. Any knowledge about how many orgs are nonprofit versus for-profit? That is an excellent question, and one where INN really has the most visibility on the nonprofit side of things, because all of our data comes from the index, which is something that we distribute across our membership, which is all nonprofit. But Jesse, do you have any thoughts on where we might be able to direct Roshni to get more intel on kind of the knowledge about nonprofit versus for-profit size?
Well, I would say, Lion is a great resource for collecting information about the for-profit side of things, at least in the local sphere. I know that the Pew Research Center typically collects a lot of data beyond the digital world on the size of the labor force in the newspaper, broadcasts, and other industries and so forth. So I haven't necessarily seen, and there are, of course, federal statistics as well on labor force in digital sectors and beyond. That doesn't really break out by commercial, but I would say Lion is probably the best resource for that.
Excellent. Awesome. Okay, we have a question from Sarah. So local news outlets' revenue pie charts show a significantly larger earned revenue share. What information do we have on how locals earn that? And that's a really great question, and I'll point the audience toward INN's earned revenue resources. We launched an earned revenue playbook a few years ago in partnership with the Blue Engine Collaborative that shows that earned revenue tactics that are successful for nonprofit outlets largely comes from shifting away from transactional CPM-based advertising and more towards kind of a value-based flat rate that the publishers themselves define. So that's kind of shifting away from you get X many clicks for this much, more towards, we work with partners, and our business partners pay us $5,000 a month to support our coverage. And there's much more on that in our earned revenue playbook on the INN's research page. Okay, great. We have a question from Jess. Racial representation of Native American staff in the field. So we do ask about that in our survey. We ask about Native American and Indigenous populations, since we do have several Canadian members now. And that the share of Native American and Indigenous folks across the network was a very low percentage this year. It was less than 0.5 or so percent. So we don't see a large percentage of Native American and Indigenous staff across the news network as of now. All right, we have time for one more question. And Jesse, I might ask you about this one from Damon. Is the philanthropic disparity between local, national, and issue of administrative overhead for the funder, visibility, perceived impact, all of the above? So would love, it's a good question. So would love if you could expound on that a little bit.
Sure, thank you. I am getting my head around that question. It's a question that we're actually really interested in because, and I think I would say look for more work from our team trying to unpack that, because you have a smaller number of organizations in the network that are classified as national, global, a lot of local startups, okay? But they're all these individual, mostly, sort of standalone individual organizations. So if you were to look at that data that I shared, just by percentage of organizations that are receiving the lion's share of the foundation funding, it would look even more stark, right? Like, it would appear then that national and globally focused organizations as a whole are receiving the lion's share of this foundation revenue, right? We think looking at it by staff and by labor force, money is actually going to invest in people because there's generally lower overhead in the nonprofit sector than in a lot of course, legacy media businesses. There we see that it's closer to parity, but not quite there. I would just, I guess, end by saying that, Damon, your question is a good one. I think it's an interesting one to think about as this field matures and becomes more networked, where you see more hub and spokes models and shared services across different organizations, to see how that kind of plays out with where resources are going.
Awesome. Thanks, Jesse, for taking on that one. And thank you all for joining us and hearing about index data.